So representative democracy, in short, is not only a term that comes relatively late, but it is a term to describe this cluster of institutions that all have their own unique beginnings. Most of them were not intended as such. Their use, they subsequently had, was not intended as such by their inventors. Many of them had Christian origins. The secret ballot, for instance, which I've mentioned already, its main champions were dissenting Christians who disliked the alcoholism and the thuggery of elections and thought that one key way to clean up elections was to stop the bribery and the blackmailing. And this would require that the vote which is cast is secret. It's carried out in secret. But they also likened this experience of standing behind a curtain before a table with a pencil or a thumbprint to the relationship between the individual with his or her conscience standing before God. I mean, this was the direct analogy drawn.
Sacred activity.
Exactly, and most of these institutions that came to be called representative democratic institutions had origins.
Yeah, the irony is that from the French Revolution onwards, we saw the injecting of an increasing dose of marginalization of religion, what became secularization, to the extent that in the 20th century, 19th, 20th century, democracy became more associated with secularism, as if they were dependent upon each other, as if it was a prerequisite of democracy to be secular.
I'm not sure about that. I think, of course, in the 19th century there was born this new ideology of laicism, of secularism, as it was called in England first in the 1830s. So the push to eliminate religiosity from the world, at least to marginalize it to the private conscience. Yes, there was that. There were organizations, parties, movements even, to try to do that. But the reality, I think, was rather different. Remarkable in the heartlands of representative democracy, the Atlantic region and parts of the empires that were associated with European powers. In these heartlands, the grip of Christianity remained strong, and it still does in however subtle, more or less ways. You know, in God we trust. You know, every American president makes this. And I would say that the process is a more complicated one, in which it's true that what representative democracy has done, as assembly-based democracy did before, was to open up spaces where power could be interrogated, where power relationships could be denatured. They're not given necessarily. They're not necessarily acts of God or gods or goddesses. Democracy, in other words, in the first phase and in the second phase, is a process of opening up questions about how we live. And that necessarily creates a certain space on earth for human beings themselves to decide their fates.
Yeah, but religion...
This is not secularism. This is a process of secularization. That's true.
Religion always has a say in how we live. That's what religion is about. And I think what we saw happening is some sort of a compromise, probably in Europe.
Contested, always contested, and today again highly contested, as we see in the most powerful representative democracy on the face of the earth, the United States. Religiosity has made a huge comeback, and the attempt to Christianize the polity. I mean, this is not for the first time in the American Republic. This is at least the third renaissance of religion. And it's a paradox that although democracy has a certain secularizing effect on the world, it tends to open up areas of life and, so to say, free them immediately from the hand of God or gods and goddesses, it creates spaces for believers to come back, to make a comeback.
It is, what is really astonishing is that in the debate today about democracy and religion, especially with respect to democracy and Islam, people who reject the assumption of a compatibility between Islam and democracy exist on both sides. There are people in the Muslim world or Muslims, people on the Western side or Westerners who insist on defining democracy in secular terms so that it cannot be expected, or it is unthinkable for them that you can have a form of an Islamic democracy, for instance.
They're amnesiacs. Those who think like that, those who think that, for example, Islamic democracy is an oxymoron, that by definition democracy has to be thoroughly secular, know nothing about their history, and that's disturbing. They can't, if you like, explain where they came from, because all of their institutions that they value, elections, parties, rule of law, parliaments, so on, these are all bound up with religious beginnings and the spirit of religion. There is no doubt about this. One of the striking things about this new history of democracy, which I'm trying to write, is the way in which it always is a hybrid. That is, an attempt to find a language to define it and redefine it. I mean, that's part of its history. That's one of the remarkable things about it. And it's in the period of representative democracy that there is this hybridization that goes on. So, for example, newfangled terms appear for the first time. Representative democracy. For the Greeks, this is a completely unintelligible entity. What is this representative democracy? They knew nothing of representation. Christian democracy, social democracy, socialist democracy. And in the recent Chinese white paper on democracy, they speak of people's democracy based on people's power, which is seems to be an overuse of the word.
How do you define it?
People, exactly. And this is the point, that our experience, our contemporary experience of democracy should remind us to be pluralists. There are multiple forms of democracy that have been practiced in the past and are going on in the present. They have different names, and so the question that the Turkish writer, who presently is in some trouble for saying so, has put it, Orhan Pamuk, in his novel Snow, whether countries, great powers like the United States and Britain and other EU member states will recognize the legitimacy of experiments in power sharing that go under the name of democracy, but have other words attached to them, like Islamic democracy. Or the question for Pamuk is, are we willing to recognize the legitimacy of and learn to live with, and therefore to compromise with non-violently, and to respect, to give dignity, to grant dignity to experiments in power sharing that do not have our own characteristics? How to democratize democracy? This is one of the great unsolved political problems of our time, and there is, I think, no more dangerous and extraordinary laboratory, this process, in what is today called the Middle East. It's in that region where there is the highest concentration of dictatorship on the earth.
And where democracy is hindered by even the liberal democracies of the West.
Yes. And where it's forcible implantation, like an injection, some sharp needle that is put into an ailing body. The presumptuousness that this could start a process of democracy seems to me to be full of hubris And anybody who is a democrat and worth their salt should reject it as hubris.
Well, had there been a consensus on a procedural definition of democracy, like saying, for instance, as you and many others have been saying, that democracy is about government being elected, accountable, transparent, the rule of law, equality before the law, a set of basic human rights, civil liberties, minority rights, etc., then we can agree worldwide on a format of democracy irrespective of how it's described or what name is given to it. However, political and economic interests move into the scene and decide on the basis of whether this is potentially good or bad for our interests, whether to accept it as a democracy or not.
Yes. I think we are living in times in which we, and I speak collectively, I think we don't understand what's going on properly with so-called democracy on the earth.
And where democracy is hindered by even the liberal democracies of the West.
Yes. And where it's forcible implantation, like an injection, some sharp needle that is put into an ailing body. The presumptuousness that this could start a process of democracy seems to me to be full of hubris, and anybody who is a democrat and worth their salt should reject it as hubris.
Well, had there been a consensus on a procedural definition of democracy, like saying, for instance, as you and many others have been saying, that democracy is about government being elected, accountable, transparent, the rule of law, equality before the law, a set of basic human rights, civil liberties, minority rights, etc., then we can agree worldwide on a format of democracy irrespective of how it's described or what name is given to it. However, political and economic interests move into the scene and decide on the basis of whether this is potentially good or bad for our interests, whether to accept it as a democracy or not.
Yes. I think we are living in times in which we, and I speak collectively, I think we don't understand what's going on properly with so-called democracy. Well, it may be. I think that new things have been born, the positive. New institutions have been born and are being created under our noses that suggest that, globally speaking, we are moving into an era beyond representative democracy. What are the symptoms of this? The globalization of the language. It's the first time in the history of democracy that there are experiments going on and the valuation of the language of democracy worldwide. You know that the old joke that in English there are three key words that are now global: Coca-Cola, OK, and democracy. This captures something of a trend which is unprecedented. It has roots, of course, in the 19th century, and it has even older roots, but it's only in our times, beginning in the middle of the 20th century and showing no signs of going away, that there is this globalization of the language of democracy as a norm.